When I bought Greedfall earlier this year, I was very curious. It seemed like it had a pretty unique approach, and frankly, I wasn't even sure about what I should expect from the game. Thus, I kinda jumped in with an open mind, ready to discover what it was all about. Now that I'm done with it, it's clear that Greedfall left a generally strong impression on me, so in this video, we'll cover the ways in which Greedfall surprised me, but also the not-so-great issues that one might expect from such an ambitious project being developed by a smaller studio. This video will include spoilers, so be aware of that, and check out my spoiler-free version of the video in the description if you prefer that. So, welcome to Paradoxia Gaming, and without any further ado, let's jump into the review. Greedfall is a third-person action role-playing game developed by Spiders, set in a gorgeous world inspired by the 17th, 18th century and the era of exploration. We play as the Sarde, the legate of the Congregation of Merchants, which means that we handle a bunch of political talks and we maintain constant dialogue with two main factions. First, there's Teleme, which is a sort of very religious organization, and the Bridge Alliance, which is all about science and progress. We are very much in the middle of the two and trying to maintain friendly relationships all across the board. Early on, the story has our character getting ready to leave the city of Serene in direction of the island of Tirfredi and the city of New Serene, a very underdeveloped and almost untouched location, hiding a bunch of mysteries. Our cousin and dear friend, Constantin, will accompany us for the long trip as he will be the governor of New Serene, which means that he also plays a very important role in the story. Now, the reason for such a massive trip is a mix of discovery, monitoring the current situation on the island, and maybe more importantly, to try to find a cure for the Malichor. The Malichor is a very deadly plague that's ravaging the city of Serene and will most likely take the life of the Sarde's mother very shortly. I think that the opening of the game is fairly straightforward and definitely digestible. It clearly gives purpose to the player, and the idea of exploring the island definitely is an inviting one. Once we finally arrive at Tirfredi, the game gets in a really nice rhythm which blends exploration, political games, and character development in an interesting way. With all the parties involved, which now also includes the natives of the island, who are making things even more complicated, there are a bunch of complex situations to navigate and tensions to try to diffuse. Then there's the Kurt betrayal, which I absolutely need to talk about, because up to that point, Kurt was probably my most used companion. He at some point raised concerns about the Coin Guard, a mercenary organization which he was a part of, and unfortunately I mostly ignored him, and as a result he ended up plotting with them and betraying me. I ended up deciding to kill him for his betrayal, therefore losing a companion, which hurts a lot when the party limit is only 2 because each of them end up playing a more important role. So I'd say that event was probably the first time that Greedfall really shocked me, and let me tell you, it wouldn't be the last. But for now, let's move on and let's tackle a few other strong story moments that are quite memorable for me, and then we'll move on and talk a little bit about the combat and gameplay systems. So first of all, there's the whole discovery of the history of the congregation on the island, and it's really a major turning point in the story because it means that many secrets were kept from the Sarde and Constantin back home, which leads to the motivations behind their trip to begin to be doubted. It gives the search for the cure of the Malichor a new interesting dynamic, showing how their greed might be the cause of their downfall. The land might simply be fighting back after being exploited by the congregation, and Greedfall as a name for the game is starting to make a lot of sense at that point.
All the clues point in the same direction. The people from the sea who built these ruins and confronted the natives, they were us.
Another story moment that I want to mention happens a bit later in the game, and it's when we get to meet Mev, the Tirnahar Kadaktas. It's quite simple, but I think it encapsulates a lot of what I actually like from the game. It's this sort of almost mythic figure which possesses unknown powers, and she's surrounded by beasts, and I don't know, there's a very unique dynamic there, and it's definitely a moment that marked me for some reason.
You are not welcome here in Nazi.
A bit later in the game, we also get to choose, or influence rather, which leader of the natives will become the new High King, and as far as I understand, it's a very important decision as it can impact what will happen to the island long term and the potential discovery of a cure for the Malichor. I personally chose Deirdre, who had a very clear plan of regaining control of the island and getting rid of any remaining invaders, so to speak, And it's mostly because I struggled to see a world in which they could all peacefully live together, be it because of Theleme's religion or because of the Bridge Alliance's enthusiasm for progress. But unfortunately, it looks like that choice might have led to a cure for the Malichor to never be found, since everyone got pushed away from the island once everything was over. Talking about when everything was over, let's talk about the ending of the game and my thoughts on it. Sadly, I saw Constantine's descent into madness coming a bit earlier than I wished, and it felt a little bit rushed overall. I have to say though that being in front of Enon Milfrictamen with Constantine, or at least whatever remained of our cousin, and being met with a choice so important that the fate of the island itself would be decided at that moment, is just great. Essentially, we get to choose whether we want to follow Constantine on his journey to ascend as a new god of the island, thus becoming one us as well, which also means killing the current god in the process. Or we can simply kill Constantine, who is not even himself anymore, and obviously I went with that. I wish that the choice would be a little bit more difficult, but I do like how the game really allows to go to both extremes with the choice. It's like extreme evil, or like what should probably be done if you're reasonable. There's probably an argument that could be made also about the current god and the role it might have played with the Malichor, which might not exactly be the most fair of punishments, so I can see how some people might need a bit of time to think about if the current god even is a good one, but I doubt that current Constantine would be a better one. That's the main issue. Finally, that brings us to the rushed closure of the game. We get an overview of what happened shortly after to things like the island, the congregation, our companions, etc. But I really felt like we deserved a sort of celebration with the companions, something to essentially bring everything to a smoother closure than just jumping straight into a recap after killing Constantine. Not saying goodbye to the companions at the end is made even worse by the fact that we are not with our companions while pursuing Constantine at the end, so I guess overall it's just a minor complaint because overall the story of Greedfall had me on the edge of my seat for most of it, and the rushed ending does not really change any of that. And I just want to say I love how it manages to create a very intense political landscape, and it just puts the player in the middle of a lot of the major decisions, and it's something that I love in games, and I think that Greedfall did that pretty well. It's not all sunshine and rainbows, of course. I think that at times the story can definitely suffer from lazy writing, and I think they definitely sometimes opt for convenience instead of logic. And the pacing isn't always perfect, especially in the middle. There was like a moment in time where I felt like things were moving a bit slowly, and yeah, it definitely wasn't consistent, but it is still the clear highlight of the game for me. I think that the story alone made the playthrough worth the time, which is pretty impressive for a smaller studio. To wrap things up about all things story, I want to say that while the Sardae didn't impact me as much as, say, Geralt of Rivia or Arthur Morgan. By the way, I really need to finish Red Dead Redemption 2 at some point, but yeah, the Sardae can still stand tall as a very compelling character that I think did its job efficiently throughout the journey and will remain quite memorable for me. Now, we've been talking a lot about the story, but what about the combat and the gameplay mechanics? I'm gonna use two words to describe my overall feelings. The first one, shallow, and the second, enjoyable. The problem is that these two words won't work together for everyone. For me, given the strong narrative of the game, I can easily overlook the shallow game systems and focus on the story, but that won't be everyone's cup of tea. First of all, we have combat, and what's combat without interesting enemies to fight? Well, unfortunately, most of the regular enemies get very, very repetitive, both with their appearance but also with their attacks. You basically get beast-like enemies, some flying bats, humans, and that's pretty much it apart from the bosses. The fact that I was staying at range with my particular build might have made it feel even more straightforward than it can be with things like melee, but a lot of the time I just turn off my brain and approach every single pack with the same strategy, and that lasted for the entire game with no clear sense of progression or change in how the encounters played out. I ended up skipping some enemy packs, which thankfully the game allows, but it's not something that I would usually want to do if the combat was well done and rewarding, so I guess in that regard it was a little bit disappointing that I didn't always feel like interacting with the enemies, but I guess all that takes us to now talk about what I was slaying the beasts with. I was playing a magic build while also using my rifle from time to time, and I also used a little bit of melee, but I didn't invest any skill points in that, at least not early on. And while everything felt snappy, smooth, I guess mostly sounded fine and felt pretty polished, I was still left somewhat disappointed by the limited build path options that were offered to me with the skill system. I think Greedfall greatly encourages swapping between combat styles, which, had I known earlier, probably would have changed my approach, but it feels like if you want to focus on magic, for instance, you don't have a ton of options, so you better like what's there. And the talent and attribute points were fun to interact with, I'd say, but once again, they're pretty straightforward and simplistic overall. The bosses on the other end were for the most part very thematically and visually appealing, which I liked a lot, but most of them, their fights felt pretty simple overall. There would also be some pretty lengthy moments without any significant encounters in the main quests. Towards the end, it definitely became way more frequent, which I guess makes sense, right? But I wish that overall we could have gotten a bit more of them. The final boss, which is the one defending Constantine at the end of the game, was definitely one of the coolest, and I just have to play a clip from that fight. Before moving on from combat, there's one more thing I want to mention. Of course, this is all coming from my perspective, playing a magic build from range, so maybe the bosses are very difficult and you really have to learn their mechanics if you're doing some close combat with melee, so it's all coming from my perspective. Let's keep that in mind. Alright, so alchemy, crafting, and itemization suffer from similar issues, I'd say, than the combat does. They are very easy to get into, they're also pretty easy to master, and once more, the game allows you to interact with many systems, but also almost makes them optional. It's a fine approach, especially given the other strengths of the game as I mentioned earlier, and it really allows the players to focus on what matters and what they actually care about with as little friction elsewhere as possible. So, closing thoughts on the combat and the gameplay systems, progression, all of that, are that I think that what's in the game actually feels pretty good, polished, it's competent, it's frictionless as I discussed, but I don't think it allows for the depth that some players are going to be looking for, so it's really a matter of personal preference, but overall I did have some fun interacting with the systems regardless. In terms of navigating the world, I found moving from a place to another to be fairly complicated and frustrating. It was mostly caused by some pretty horrible zone layouts at times, not all the time, and overall some very unintuitive cities to navigate. The repetitive landscapes, music, and encounters can also lead to a lack of variety, which gets old rather quickly. It's sad because the art is gorgeous, it's beautiful, and I really wish I could see what the game would be like if they actually had AAA resources, but the reused assets and layouts in places like the palaces of the factions on the island, for example, were disappointing to witness, and it's there to remind us that it is not a AAA title, and I still have to say that exploration is oftentimes still worth the wait, because there are destinations in the game that feel new, fresh, and are breathtaking. So, for example, I think that a lot of the locations that are related to the native tribes, for example, made the journey way more enjoyable for me. I want to say that I thought that Greedfall's graphics were very appealing, and I often found myself looking around just to fully take the stunning visuals, and I'd say it's definitely an aspect of the game that significantly contributed to my enjoyment of the game, despite the limitations that I did talk about. Okay, let's switch gears and focus on the companions for a minute, because boy is it not what I actually expected before playing the game. I only recently started playing party-based RPGs or CRPGs, and I'm used to controlling the other companions in combat. Greedfall's approach, where yes, they're fighting with you, but you have a very limited control over them, is fine. It's probably a little bit a matter of personal taste as well, but I can see how it could lead to some confusion for some people, especially when I see the game often compared to Dragon Age Origins or things like that. To be fair, I think that they made the right choice, because I doubt that they would have had the resources to make it deep and satisfying in terms of strategy, not to mention that the combat in the game is rather simplistic, and in its current state I don't really see how it would allow for many exciting scenarios. Also, the companion limit being at 2 is quite low compared to the average, yet another way Greedfall does things differently, but I'm okay with it, especially given how little they impact the combat, and I kind of like the idea of having fewer companions for a shorter game, which allows to develop each of them a little bit more. So, while they don't impact the combat in a huge way, on the narrative, it's quite the opposite, and just to give you an idea, I spent a lot of time with Kurt, Vasco, and Siora, and overall I thought it was time well spent. Kurt had a deeper connection with the Sarde, of course, given that they knew each other prior to the game's start, and I enjoyed the banter between the two. Ciora, well, I think that the fact that she's such an important figure within the native tribes made her important, but also it felt like they put a lot of care in her character, and she was often a central part of the story or dialogue. Also, her personal quest line felt important. It was all about saying goodbye to her mother for the last time with a ritual, as well as help her with some issues she was having with her group of people. And after that, I got the opportunity to romance her, which I did right before the end of the game. It was about as awkward as you'd expect it to be between two people growing up in two completely different environments.
I'll do it my way. Your body and your soul are speaking with mine on Almanawi. And if you feel the same way, I would love to spend some time alone with you.
Since the romance started late in the game, I'm not sure how impactful it would have felt over a longer period of time, but in the short time where they were together, it did impact things quite a bit, especially with a goodbye scene before the final moment of the game, which is the kind of things I wanted to see. Now for Vasco, for the most part, I'd say that I thought he was a cool character, but nothing more. Still, none of the other characters felt more appealing, so I just kept him in my party. His personal quest, which was centered around learning more about his origins, his family, and how he actually truly wants to be a Nut, was fine, but in line with the rest of the character, it won't be crazy memorable for me. Afra seemed like another decent option, but I'm not the kind of guy that usually switches companions mid-game, and we do meet her a bit later in the game, which definitely hurt her chance of being in the spotlight for me. The last one, Petrus, I guess I kind of hate him. He's like over-the-top religious and also calls me my child all the time. That's gonna be a pass from me. Overall, the companion feature shows a lot of the symptoms of being a AA game, especially when it comes to the combat portion of the experience, and one thing that I need to mention about that right away is that the companions almost always say the same combat dialogue lines. I was legit going crazy by the end of the game. I tried to mostly ignore it because, you know, it's the kind of things that I actually expect from a AA game, and I don't want something so insignificant to ruin my experience, but let's just say it definitely tested my patience for sure. There might even be a setting to turn it off, but still, they could have added a couple more lines and I don't think anybody would have complained.
Bit of poison on my blade, and let's go! Bit of poison on my blade, and let's go! Bit of poison on my blade, and let's go!
I'm gonna stop it here for your sanity, but yeah, I guess that's kind of an example of what I meant. Now back on the narrative side of things, the party members do have more substance and variety, usually in a pretty well done way, which means that in my opinion, if approached with the correct expectations, the feature is mostly fine. Unfortunately, none of the companions left a very strong impression on me, so I guess fine does sum up my thoughts on the companions pretty well. Okay, now let's focus on the audio of the game. It's a fairly strong aspect of the game. Actually, it's clear that the art direction in general in this game speaks to me. The soundtrack is very good. I'd probably give it like an 8 out of 10 if you ask me. But given how repetitive it feels and the lack of variety, it probably easily goes down to a 7, unfortunately. When it comes to the voice acting, it is mostly good with some clear standouts. For me, Constantine, Desarde, and Ciora are very convincing. Maybe the biggest problem though is the limited amount of voice actors. They keep reusing the same people, and sometimes I'd easily be able to tell that the person in front of me was voiced by the same voice actor as one of my companions. It happened quite a few times with Vasco's voice, for example, but it's really a generalized problem. Like, they really do use the same actors a lot, and it can be a bit immersion breaking, of course. Talking about immersion, the ambient noises, be it in cities or in the wild, when coupled with the soundtrack, led to a fairly immersive and atmospheric experience. Overall, the sound and environments of Greedfall lead to a strong identity, which is quite unique and fits its explorative and mysterious nature, but it still suffers from the same lack of resources mentioned so many times in the video already. Moving on, let's talk about the side content of Greedfall and the replayability of the game. While side content can often be a strong reason to go back to a game, in Greedfall's case, I've found the side content to overall be weaker than the main quests in terms of execution. They often feel drawn out or cheaply made. A very good example of that is a quest early on about a merchant selling some suspicious miracle potions. We decide to investigate, and suddenly, the merchant supposedly ran away. It happens off screen, and we don't even try to stop him or go after him. Like, he's pretty old, and I doubt that he could outrun us.
Yes, no, you don't have the right!
Damnation. He got away. He can't have gone far.
To me, that's an example of lazy writing or just maybe not having the budget to execute their vision fully. It's just a bit hard to tell which one it actually is. But things like that do happen quite a lot with the side content, unfortunately. It's not all bad though, because the ideas covered are often interesting and meaningful, like helping Ulan strike a deal with the Bridge Alliance, for example, which is another side quest, even had impacts on the main story later when Ulan was then involved. So in general, I'd say I very rarely regretted doing them. Their rough execution did lead me to skip a significant amount of content, and I don't really feel bad about it. It's clear to me then that the replay value doesn't come from the side content. Rather, I think it resides in the various important story decisions which make the player wonder what might have happened differently given all the choices that seem to have heavy consequences, especially on the ending. For me, if I play again, I want to make sure that a cure for the Malicor is found if I can reasonably get there, but I can see how a lot of the repetitive and shallow aspects of the game might lead to a less enjoyable second playthrough overall. Fortunately though, it took me only about 25 hours to finish the game, which makes the prospect of revisiting it in the future a bit less daunting. Before concluding this section, there's one more thing that I want to mention. So I'd say that my approach definitely evolved throughout the game. Like in the beginning, as I often do, I was engaging with pretty much all of the content available to me, and eventually, probably by the middle of the game or so, based on what I was seeing, I started focusing on the main story and a few companions only, and also started being quite selective about which side quests I'd engage with. I think that for me, it was the right call because it pretty much led to me feeling like I got the ideal dose of Greedfall, despite the fact that there was probably still at the very least 10 or 15 hours of additional content that I could have done. My closing thoughts on Greedfall are that, as I said at the beginning of the video, I jumped in with an open mind, ready to see what the game was all about. And I think that that approach helped a lot because I can see why some people might end up disappointed given the other games I've seen Greedfall compared to, mostly in the CRPG space. I absolutely think it was worth a playthrough though. Like, seeing what spiders managed to create with their limited resources, it really makes me curious about what Greedfall might have ended up looking like if they could fully execute their vision and bring more polish to the experience. Still, I don't want to take away from what they actually managed to accomplish, and I think that what they managed to create here with this game is actually quite impressive and leaves me with a very positive opinion in general. Also, I am aware that Greedfall 2 is currently in early access, and based on what I've seen, it's clearly trying to add more strategy to its combat, which certainly addresses some of the criticism in this video. I'm just hoping that they'll be able to retain the qualities of the first one at the same time, especially when it comes to storytelling. You know, we can always pray. In any case, I'm interested to check it out. We'll see if it'll end up fitting in my schedule with everything else that I also want to cover, but I'm definitely excited to see what they're cooking over there. Anyways, thank you so much for watching the video until the end, and please let me know in the comments what you personally thought of Greedfall if you played it. You know, the things you agree or disagree with me about, let me know about those. And yeah, that'll do it. Please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video if you enjoyed, and I'll be back soon with a new video. Bye bye.